Everyone, thanks for joining. Sorry, we're a couple of minutes late. Hope you are all safe and healthy. I'm Lindsay Tulchin. I'm a board member and events chair for NYC CBT. And it is with great pleasure that I introduce you to Dr. Bill Sanderson, my former professor and supervisor, whose guidance on treating anxiety disorders and his insight into evolutionary psychology I have cherished and used enormously in my own practice. Dr. Sanderson is professor of psychology at Hofstra University, where he directs the anxiety and depression clinic. There, he is also director of the Ph.D. program in clinical psychology. Dr. Sanderson received his Ph.D. in 1987, working under the mentorship of Dr. David Barlow at the Center for Stress and Anxiety Disorders, University at Albany. He then completed a fellowship in cognitive therapy with Dr. Aaron Beck at the Center for Cognitive Therapy, University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Sanderson is a founding fellow of the Academy of Cognitive Therapy and is presently a board member. He has participated on numerous national committees, including the American Psychiatric Association's DSM-4 Anxiety Disorders Workshop, served as editor of The Clinical Psychologist, and was the chair of the American Psychological Association Division of Clinical Psychology's Committee on Science and Practice, a task force aimed at identifying and promoting the practice of evidence-based psychological interventions. Dr. Sanderson has published more than 100 articles, including 7 books, primarily in the areas of anxiety, depression, personality disorders, and evidence-based treatments. At present, his primary interest is integrating evolutionary psychology and clinical psychology. He has also worked tirelessly to create and disseminate a self-help guide for managing negative emotions during the pandemic, which has circulated worldwide. We are so honored to have you speaking with us today. So without further ado, here's Dr. Bill Sanderson.
Thanks, Lindsay. It's nice to be here, or actually where I always am, in my office on Zoom. We can even talk about that a little bit later. But it's, I just want to share my screen here. Hold on. Okay. And I just want to check. Do you have the first slide now? First slide there? Okay, good. So I'm going to be talking about the impact of the pandemic on human nature, and then definitely get to specific how-tos on how to reduce psychological distress, or sort of adapting CBT strategies to do so. Just as a starting point, I have 3 areas that I plan to cover today. One, empirical view of human nature. For those of you who are around me, you know that I can't stop talking about this. I believe this is the most important topic for a most important topic for psychology and beyond. Physical health, we'll talk a little bit about. Politics, we won't talk anything about today, but it's definitely relevant. Second area that I'll cover is the toxic impact of the pandemic on human nature. That's the reason to cover the first section. It explains why, sorry, I'm just trying to move this here. Okay, good. It explains why there may be a mental health pandemic on the horizon and what needs to be done to try to avoid it. And 3, I'll talk about the nature and treatment of pandemic-related psychological distress, with a focus on managing distress and promoting resilience. Because we need to use CBT to help the general population manage their distress, I will be providing links to materials we develop along the way. And in the end, I will give you a location where you can access these slides and just click on the links that way. Just one thing to note here, I have 671 slides. So we'll be going through these very quickly, many of them very quickly to make a point. Some I'll stick with more. But the slides will be made available at the end so that you can view them. And I don't have 671, but I have about 60. Okay, so let's start with the first topic, empirical view of human nature. And I want to cover 4 sub areas here. Once again, I'll go through this quickly. 1, the case for universal human nature that I've been trying to make. Controversial idea? It is, I'll show you. 2, CBT does not have an agreed upon theory of human nature. In fact, clinical psychology does not in general, which seems like an obvious omission. People that deal with humans not having a set idea about human nature. Something I often say here is, would you agree to pet sit for an animal that you didn't know its nature, right? Depending on what it is, that may affect your decision. It's very important. 3, what is the empirical view of human nature? And I will lay out some of the current thinking on human motives and needs that comprise what I consider the empirical view of human nature. And then 4, just very briefly, because this is particularly relevant to mental health and clinical psychology, did evolution build us well to function in our modern environment? And I will just cover that briefly and point you to more information on that. Just a disclaimer here. I'm going to go through this section quickly. You may find some of the points in this section controversial. I'm more than willing to take questions for this at the end. We're going to hold questions at the end. I believe you can put them in the chat and then someone's going to read them to me at the end. So I think that's the least clunky way to do something on Zoom. Otherwise, you spend 10 minutes just trying to get the question out.
Sorry to interrupt, Bill. There's also a little, I think participants can see a little Q&A instead of a chat. You can just hit Q&A and you can submit your question there. It's a little bit easier for us to manage them that way. So
great. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So Jason, can you launch the first poll? Give 15 seconds. You must enter. I can see it. I don't know if everybody can. Oh, I guess I could take the poll. It's not a hard question. 15 seconds, Jason, and then you could just present the results. All right. For those of you who said tiger, I'm going to find out who you are and make good on that promise. But the reality is that most of you do know that each of these animals has a different nature, right? That really matters in the decision that you might make, that a tiger is much more threatening than a horse. A basic point, but something we'll see that we take for granted when we're talking about human nature. So just sort of hold that there. And then Jason, can you launch poll 2? See the question, would you be more comfortable getting into an elevator alone at night with a stranger who is male or female? All right, same thing, 15 seconds. All right, and so you know something about human nature. You know that males are more dangerous than females. And that's an interesting point to consider as well, right? So all species have a nature and humans have a nature, and even based on sex, you can make predictions about that nature. So where I go for all my answers is to either Google or Wikipedia, and this is the definition of human nature. That's a bundle of characteristics, including ways of thinking, feeling, and acting, which humans are said to have naturally. The term is often regarded as capturing what is to be human or the essence of humanity. I underline this next section because it's interesting. This term is controversial because it's disputed whether or not such an essence exists, right? Whether or not human nature exists is considered to be controversial. Very controversial in psychology, by the way. So let's just, if you will, bear with me with this. We'll agree to these, assuming that you believe in the theory of evolution. And once again, we can come back to some of these nuances later on if you have questions. 1, all species evolve through the process of natural selection. That really determines our nature. Humans are just another species, right? Most evolutionary biologists agree with that. Like all species, humans have a coherent and predictable nature, something that we call human universals, that is only superficially influenced by the environment, culture. This is the controversial point. I'll talk a little bit about this in a couple of slides. 4, all species are designed to function in the environment in which they evolved. Most humans no longer function in that landscape. This creates evolutionary mismatches that can lead to negative outcomes that are very relevant to clinical psychology. We'll talk a bit about a theory of psychopathology and definitely related to the pandemic, where mismatches create emotional distress. And I would even argue many of the disorders like anxiety and depression that we see. So my basic tenet is in this section, evolutionary psychology must be the foundation of all other areas of psychology, including clinical psychology, to move the field forward. So here are the major areas of psychology. And this is my grading here, right? And so biological and cognitive, they've integrated evolutionarily psychology the best, developmental not too bad. Interestingly, the ones that deal most with human behavior, very poor. I give clinical psychology an F in this area. Social psychology is heading to an F. They started with the D. That's another story. As I see it, one way to try to think about clinical psychology or CBT, which is the emphasis of the group here probably today, is we really focus on this area, right? We focus on in training our students in books and so on. We focus on psychopathology and then treatment aimed at psychopathology. And the fact is that what we're missing is the green boxes here, which is what is human nature, right? Why is that not a foundational part of what we're taught? And then let's first understand normal emotions and normal psychological processes as mental adaptations, right, that have a particular function before we get into psychopathology, right? So this is the way that medicine goes about things. They teach, normal biological functioning before diseases. And the reason I think that that's important is it leads us, once again, to not fully appreciate some of the underlying functions of mental processes that we have. And I'll refer to these as mental adaptations. I'll get more into this, but just as an example, a mental adaptation is rumination. A mental adaptation is social evaluative concern, right? All of these things are believed to have been adaptive. I'll get more into that in a bit. Just want to give you a flavor for this. So I feel like we really need to work harder at filling out this side of the equation. So what must take place for human evolution to occur? The reason that's important is the process of natural selection determines the nature of the species. And so that's what we have to figure out. So this is a little bit too basic for humans, not too much, but the idea, right, we have to survive and reproduce. Now, humans are a social species, so social species are a bit more complex, and we'll get into that. This is a critical slide here to appreciate, and this is the empirical view of human nature. It's the most broad view of this, so we'll start with the most broad view of this. And it's sort of similar to Maslow's hierarchy. In fact, it was based on that idea, except it's empirically based upon evolutionary psychology. And like Maslow's hierarchy, it starts at the bottom in terms of importance and moves up the ladder. And but what you could see is it's deliberately meant to be open because new issues can appear, right? So just as an example, the pandemic is a perfect example. If you will, like most of us were not thinking about our immediate physical needs or so much about self-protection, but all of a sudden, when these things become threatened, boom, we get down to those levels. And all of a sudden you see people hoarding food, hoarding toilet paper, hoarding Purell, things they weren't doing before. Change in context makes these things relevant. So, so this is the broad scheme. And there's three evolutionary processes that go on here in humans, right? So survival, you have to meet physiological needs and engage in self-protection. The fact that humans are a social species, they care about affiliation and status. These things matter greatly to how well people do in life, how they feel, if they're chosen as a mate or not, if they're chosen as a leader or not. And so this is the social species part, something that we call inclusive fitness. I won't talk too much about that today. And then they have to reproduce. And this is a critical cycle for evolution to take place. Each one of us is a product of individuals who survived, got along with others well enough to continue their survival, find someone to mate with, and then successfully raise their offspring. And so this is a never-ending process in the evolutionary scheme. And just a sidebar here, one way to reconceptualize emotions from an evolutionary perspective is that emotions are actually motivational states aimed at helping us meet these motives. So this would be sort of similar to someone like Richard Lazarus, the idea of goal congruent or goal incongruent emotions. So if you will, when you're eating, high fattening food, it creates dopamine. You're really meeting your immediate physiological needs. You feel positive. And then if food's not available, you feel very negative or distressed. And that's because you're not meeting that physiological need. And that distress motivates you, right? The idea of motives motivates you to try to pursue meeting these needs. So I know I'm packing a lot into this slide here. Some of these ideas, parts of these ideas you may be familiar with. And once again, we can come back if there's any confusion later on. We just have to start with this figure. So the question is, why don't we have a blank slate? And the reason is that, why don't we have a coherent view of human nature? My blank slate is being covered up over here. Is this blank slate hypothesis that continues to plague the social sciences model, including clinical psychology. And it goes back to a statement that is the classic statement. Everyone sort of heard this at some level, of Watson's statement that basically he can create anyone he wants because we all have a blank slate. You just have to provide the right context or environment or reinforcement schedule. And this is the idea of a blank slate, is everybody starts out the same, that there's no different competencies, there's no different traits, we're all the same. Now, the reality is in science, even in social sciences, we have moved beyond this model to some degree. However, not as far as you might think. So I'm actually thinking this now as what's called the blankish slate hypothesis. And actually, this is something my students made for me. I actually have a slate in my office that says blankish on it. Took a picture of it for today. And the idea here is that no one fully holds to the idea that humans' brains are actually a full blank slate. However, we constantly make judgments in this area that pertain to a more blank slate explanation than an evolutionary explanation. And people like Jeffrey Miller and Steven Pinker point out that most explanations of human behavior are based upon ideology rather than science. This is a very controversial area that I won't get into too much here. I'll just make one statement about it and then hope you forget about it by the end of the presentation. Here's the statement. I'm always on the denial of human nature watch, especially as it pertains to clinical psychology. Our organization, American Psychological Association, put out this guideline for psychological practice with boys and men. Nowhere in this document, it's a long document, do they mention the term testosterone. Now that's an odd omission for a document, and they are much more focused on socialization of masculinity, in particular about things like aggressivity. My beloved New York Times, that's really into denial of human nature lately, they published an op-ed piece, It's Dangerous to Be a Boy, somewhat based on this document. It's dangerous to be a boy. They smoke more, fight more, are far more likely to die young than girls, but their tendency to violence isn't innate, is the subtitle. Now, that is scientifically false, not even ambiguous. It's scientifically false, right? And I just want to raise 2 points for you. First of all, as I often tell my students in my evolutionary psych class, you know when they say never choose the answer that says something is always true? Well, this is the example. You choose the answer, it's always true, meaning that in every culture, society, tribe, group studied, males are more aggressive than females. They murder more, they commit more violent crimes, and so on. Overwhelmingly the case, by the way, not even borderline. So one, that sort of extracts any type of cultural influence, unless every culture is doing the same thing, which by definition, in my opinion, changes it from a cultural impact to human universal. The other thing to keep in mind, this is true of every species. Every species, males compete and are much more aggressive than females are. In general, they tend to die earlier and so on. So you can't have something that you believe is socialized if it's true in every social system and every species. I won't get into it today. It makes sense why males are more violent. And there's an evolutionary explanation for it. I could point you to something at the end if you want to see more about that. Once again, if you could just sort of trust me on this for now. So I'm leaving the idea of human nature to Jungian psychology because the behaviorists have clearly failed in doing this. And by the way, I regret to say that as someone that was trained as a staunch behavioral psychologist. And instead, I think the way to think of human nature is that, more similar to the idea of a collective unconscious, that we have mental mechanisms, psychological adaptations that we've inherited from all of our ancestors who have survived, reproduced, successfully parented, and so on. And those, we know we have physical attributes. Mental adaptations are sort of a harder concept to get around. The closest analogy I often use here, I'm not doing an advertisement for iPhone, is our brains are like an iPhone. When you get your iPhone, it's not a blank slate, it's not a blank disk. It comes with applications that are built into it already. Now you can, with regard to this, you can add applications, right? So there's influences from the environment, but the main functions are there, and they're based on what people want. Apple knows that people want a text app and an email app and a calendar app, and that's what they put in. So, so this is a good analogy for, if you will, an evolved mind that includes mental adaptations. So by the way, this is the slide I'm most proud of, so we'll sort of linger on this for a second. Took me a little bit to put this together. This is not, if you're confused, this is not an MRI view of the brain, but what we have here is exactly the way we conceive the brain, which is all these modules. These are evolved psychological adaptations, and when the right stimulus occurs, it triggers the right one, and that creates a certain emotional response or action pattern that's based on solving that problem. So we could start with this very simple idea. Humans, the most common fear in humans is snakes. What we know about the evolutionary environment is that snakes were present. So those who found snakes were cute were eliminated from the gene pool when they went to pet them. Those who feared snakes were more likely to survive and live another day. And as a result, this mechanism exists in the brain. And for the record, once again, if you think that socialization is a big factor here, not really. You can go to the zoo, you'd probably get arrested for this, but you could throw even a snake fake into a fake snake into a monkey cage, and the monkeys, even raised in zoos, are terrified of snakes. Primates had the same problem that humans had in the evolutionary environment. And what you could see here, right, is that all of these mechanisms, gossip and humor and parenting and mate choice, and what we find attractive and caring about what people think of us, these are all psychological adaptations. Just for your information, right, better than the cartoon view, is that this is an open source model. People are now defining, similar to periodic tables, what these human evolved psychological adaptations are. This is an incredibly impressive project, by the way, if you want to take a look at it. And not only are they looking at by type of evolutionary selection what develops, but also they're looking at the proximate mechanisms, like what's happening in the brain when this is activated, delineating the function and so on. This is too complicated to get into now, but once again, I'm providing here, I'll give you the slides at the end so you can access the links. I'm just providing it for you to see. This is human nature. This table will define human nature much more broadly than that hierarchy that I put up before. Can you launch poll 3? "15 seconds. Hopefully these are not complicated questions. All right. Okay. So 86% father is taller than mother. That's actually a little lower than the general population. That's closer to 93%, but it's still a high percent. And it's an interesting point.
You can't, right?
Because think about it. What we know is that that females choose males who are taller than them, but they're not sure why. They just know that they find it more attractive. This is a good example of what we call an archaic response. It evolved because it's believed that that females gain protection from males in the evolutionary environment. And as a result, they're more prone to choose a taller male. If you look at any action movie, you will never see a shorter male in those, even if it's true, like Tom Cruise is about 5'8", my height. They put him, literally, they put him on boxes to look taller so that he looks sort of more aggressive. And so it's an interesting concept, even though you could argue in the modern environment, males are not really providing physical protection for females. It's the most common thing that males lie about on OkCupid and those various sources. And the reason they lie is because it matters. Women put in search cues that actually require a certain height, usually at least an inch taller than themselves. So this gets along the idea that what we try to do is we try to think of modern behavior as having roots, as contemporary behavior as having its roots in evolutionary psychology or our evolutionary history. And if you will, you could see here from 650 BC, males bringing in food for the group, so to speak. And then, well, no, that's probably not a good thing. I don't think anybody wants you to bring a deer to a date, but certainly males are still expected to pay for credit cards. And what's interesting is even as female financial equality has increased, this number remains basically the same over time, right? So for the most part, a male going on a date and saying, let's make this Dutch treat is not an attractive move by females. Females report on that. Okay, so we're gonna slightly change to the part, now that you have this background, that's perhaps the most relevant to clinical psychology. And it's called Mismatch Theory. And I wrote a blog post about this a while ago, which is we live in a zoo. And I think one way to think about humans is we're living in a zoo, meaning, and you might say that a lot of days, but I have a very specific meaning for this, which is that we live in an environment that we did not involve in, right? We live in urban areas with lots of people, or even suburban areas with lots of people. We're not engaged in the types of activities that we evolved doing. And as a result, this could create a problem. And what's interesting to note, and this is pre-pandemic, by every metric, individuals living in industrialized countries, physical and mental health has been steadily declining. I'm going to run through just a few slides here to make the point, and once again, you could follow up with more detail, right? So let's get to the essence of mismatch, though, first of all. I won't do a poll here, but I know most people prefer ice cream and cookies compared to broccoli or romaine lettuce with no dressing on it. We evolved, this is just to illustrate mismatch theory, we evolved in a food scarce environment. And as a result, those who preferred high fattening foods were more likely to survive. Those who preferred low calorie foods, less likely to survive. So this is an adaptation, but there were no cookies and ice cream in the evolutionary environment. So it was more parts of foods that people preferred, fatty foods as an example of an animal. But we see a mismatch here. So humans used to hunt for their food. It was scarce. It was hard to come by. You burn tons of calories getting it. Now we just, go online and have someone bring it to us. You don't even need to move from your seat. So that's one mismatch, right? This is an environmental mismatch. This is what this taste preference evolved for. It hasn't changed at all in this very recent past. This is what we're doing now. And likewise, there's artificial foods that have calorie contents that just don't exist in the natural environment. You couldn't find a piece of fruit that has the calorie content of a Dorito. And this is just for the record, designed to be the most tasty with no care about nutrition. So it's no surprise that if we look at obesity rate, this is a great example of mismatch. What you could see is just from 1960, this enormous increase as we move less and we eat more processed foods. And the projection for 2030 is a 50% obesity rate in the US. And this translates to hundreds of billions of dollars in medical costs. Diabetes would be just one example of that. Well, what about mental health mismatches? Well, once again, there's lots here. I'm just going to point it out. People are more miserable than ever before. This is the misery index, but you can see it's just going up and up over time, right? If you looked at it now, it would be off the charts, but this is all pre-pandemic. Something's going on that's important to note. And the idea of mismatch theory is why are we more miserable? is because we're living in an environment that we're not well designed for. Suicide rate is increasing. So let me just bring back my favorite slide here. Let's look at an example of a mismatch. Social comparison. We weren't meant to have constant social comparison. So I use this light switch example here, right? If you use the light switch on and off all day, it probably would break much more quickly than it was designed to last for. This is what's happening to our evolved mechanisms. So if we look at something like social comparison, right, we're built to compare ourselves to others and compete with them. That really matters in all environments, in all contexts that humans exist in. However, we weren't built to be around the clock all day with people around the world comparing ourselves to. And it's covered up here, but on my slide, that what we see then is this creates levels of envy that lead to depression, right? It's literally we're built for social comparison at a certain level, like you turn your light switch on and off a couple of times a day, not for continuous social comparison. And I won't show you the slides here, but what we're seeing is the more people use social media, the more likely it is that they develop depression, as an example. So this is an example of the mismatch. And just like a Dorito chip, you know you're addicted to it, even though you know that you can't stop, right? People even know that it makes them feel bad, but they can't stop. Okay, 2, toxic impact of the pandemic on human nature, which explains the widespread and severe psychological distress. So we could look at just 2 primary emotional reactions that we have. We'll keep it simple here. It's fear and sadness. And it makes sense in terms of the landscape that we're in right now. Fear is the response to threat to our survival, right? Danger. And it functions to protect us from those threats. And I'll get into this in a second. And sadness is the response to losses, right? The grief reaction. It functions to motivate us to restore these losses that are essential for our well-being. And as you know, both perceptions of danger and losses have pervaded the landscape with regard to COVID and the pandemic. So let's look through back here on the fundamental human motives, and let's look at each of these and see what the pandemic's doing to this. And thanks to some of my doctoral students for helping me round this out. Think about it, concerns about supply chain, food limitations, right? Going to a food market and waiting online, items not being there, right? You couldn't get things like rice or soup, as an example. A loss of job and financial concerns that are necessary to even pay for access, food and shelter and so on, right? This has become a common theme of the pandemic. Self-protection, right? COVID directly threatens people's well-being and survival. People are worried about getting sick and dying from COVID. Increased vulnerability as a result of inability to go to the doctor or hospital if you have another sickness, right? People are not going to emergency rooms even when there's something going on because they're afraid of catching COVID. Loss of health insurance, increased vulnerability as government fails to protect, right? We're not feeling very safe in terms of the way things have been handled. And people even have concerns of anarchy, that if things had gotten that bad, might all, any type of social system break down and people just be taking food off the shelves and looting and so on if that became necessary. This is a big one, affiliation, humans need for affiliation. Social distancing is what we need to do in order to decrease the spread of COVID. This creates loneliness, this hashtag alone together. I mean, just think at how perverse that idea is. Fear of others, right? You cross the street so that you don't get too close to them. You don't want to touch anybody, maybe even people in your family. Mass faces are hard to read, right? People read people's face in terms of determining things like safety or friendliness. As an example, the masked face creates more stress there. Actual bereavement, loss of ability to worship as a group for those that are religious, right? These are all losses. Status, esteem, loss of meaning, whatever that may be for people, work, grandparenting, volunteering, spectating and participating in sports, right? Blocked from pursuing values that create personal esteem in general. Right? Basically, we're all on pause and things are slowly coming back, but certain things may never come back or still are long from coming back. Mate acquisition, right? Many articles have written about this, threatening landscape for dating and intimate encounters. Someone was telling me this morning that they went on a socially distanced date. Sounds like an odd concept, but I guess that's what's necessary. Definitely not satisfying these needs. Mate retention, another human need. Relationship stressors, many people have written about this. The challenge of being in too much contact as a result of quarantine. I mean, people weren't meant to be in the house all the time. People were doing their own thing. All of a sudden, you have families quarantined together, spouses quarantined together. It can be a challenge for people. And the one that's, I don't have young children, but the one that's quite frightening is this one, parenting. The stress of homeschooling, challenges of caring for young children while working from home, concerns of child development in an asocial and non-physical contact environment. And then just think of your view for children in the future, even young adults. How will people flourish given what's going on right now? So my argument is that, and I wrote a blog post on this, I mean, I think other than a war zone, I can't think of a worse circumstance that in terms of hitting on blocking, meeting so many human needs. And going back to the point I made earlier, if emotions trigger us, motivate us to meet these needs, that's where these fear and sadness in particular come from. But the problem is some of these things there's not much you can do about. Okay, 3, adapting CBT to deal with pandemic-related psychological distress to try to avoid a mental health pandemic. Right, just for the record, many people have written about this. There's lots of concern about a mental health pandemic that will even outlast the COVID pandemic. And so that's something that as mental health professionals, clearly that we want to take seriously. So let's start with the bottom line here, a couple of points and then I'll share with you some of the strategies and things that we've done to try to address this. First of all, one of the things that I found with regard to dealing with the general public on some interviews and other things I've done, don't underestimate psychoeducation. We actually have a culture that's fairly, that's not very psychologically sophisticated. So they don't really, many people don't even understand why they have the feelings that they have. So we could start with this idea, it's perfectly normal and expected to feeling fearful and sad during this time. Right, we're living through a pandemic, right? Last time people did that was 1918. So this is certainly a novel circumstance that we should take seriously, and the impact on our mental health needs to be taken seriously as well, but it's explainable. That being said, it's essential to manage these feelings, or they can potentially turn into clinical disorders, right? Sort of that's what we're concerned about in mental health. And we have proven strategies to manage emotions and their impact. So the good news is we need to bring those things to the general public, those that are suffering, maybe not clinically, but once again, to sort of stave off clinical disorders. 2 things, right? Therapists can set the right tone. So if you show people my slide of how this blocks human nature, right, they'll probably run out of your office or click you off of a Zoom meeting. But humans are resilient. We will get through this. COVID will pass. Almost all of us will still be alive in its aftermath and get back to our normal lives, right? That's the good news. Also, what we want to do is facilitate a post-traumatic growth mindset, and I'll get to more of this later on. But we can be better off after this because we now know just how much we take for granted, right, as a result of it being taken away, and thus we can appreciate our lives more. By the way, even just being alive or not being sick. But I'll talk about how it gets to be more than that. So the treatment that I'm going to talk about, we refer to as pandemic-related stress disorder. And it's essentially trying to characterize what is the nature of pandemic-related psychological distress. And then it's essentially adapting standard CBT strategies that many of you are already well aware of, but to the specific triggers related to COVID and to the pandemic. These resources are available to everyone. Once again, I'll give you the links to this as we go along here. I will present some highlights. There's too much to obviously to cover here. And I will refer to these 2 recommended documents for you to take a look at. So one is we have a self-help guide, and that's the link to that. Interesting, by the way, just a little backstory on this. I think partly because of being socially, being quarantined, I didn't know what to do with myself. And so I said to my students, why don't we develop a self-help document for dealing with COVID-related distress. This was end of March when things just started in New York area anyway. And what's interesting is that this sort of does show the power of the internet. We developed this document, and I believe maybe on April 6th, we put it out. And it literally, I tracked where people were accessing it from. It literally made it throughout the world on every continent. So it's amazing what you could distribute now for free, right, in a very non-traditional way, and not have to delay as going through a journal or some type of more, sort of academic document. So this I would recommend. You can take a look at it, but this is a great resource for patients or individuals that you know that might be suffering. We turn that into more of a treatment manual type of document that's in the process of being published shortly. For now, you can access the preprint at that document, at that link. It will be open source because it's COVID related, so it will be available within the next week or so in terms of a PDF format. And just to point to, this is table 1 in that document, where we sort of look at the problems and then kind of the solutions to these problems. And you recognize many of the terms that we use here to deal with remedying these issues. So I will sort of touch on some of these, or what I think are the main ones. And then once again, you could refer to this document, you can access this document, and you could look up the problem and the way that we've adapted the treatment. Let me start, since we're going to talk about mismatch, let's start with basic mood regulation strategies. And for the record, that what we know already is that these things are all being compromised as a result of our unnatural environment. We're not getting enough sunlight, we're not getting enough sleep, we're too sedentary, we're eating processed foods, and we're engaged in all this technology that's making us miserable, not able to sleep, and so on. And so we start there, and the pandemic further spins this, because you're supposed to stay inside, and as a result, your sleep pattern's all off. And you're supposed to stay inside. How much exercising can you do? You lose all the incidental walking of driving to a parking lot, walking to your office. So we start here in trying to sort of do a checkup and make sure people are starting to kind of meet these needs that we know are important, not just in physical health, but increasingly important in mental health as well. Okay, so you will know that this talk is not being brought to you by any media outlet. I've been sort of pretty harsh on the media, and I think this is a perfect example. So my number one strategy that I would tell people in any interview or dealing with people directly is do not consume media, whether it be social media about COVID, television, or too much reading. The fact of the matter is, you can keep yourself up to date probably in 15 minutes reading per day at any point, right? There's just a redundant 24/7 experience of people on the media, TV, and so on, of constantly being barraged. I'll go back to my light switch metaphor here. We weren't supposed to be having threat information presented to us most of our waking day. It's popping up on your phone. It's every channel. And so on. So you need to be informed, but you don't need to just keep listening to what you know over and over again. And I found particularly concerning and, in my opinion, distasteful that you had on every channel, you had a scoreboard of how many are sick, how many people have died, and so on. And that definitely raises people's perception of risk. I mean, just think for a second. Imagine if you did this for anything else. I believe in the US, there's something like 600,000 deaths from cancer per year. Imagine if every day they sort of kept that running tally on the news media. It would make you much more frightened. I'm not saying that's not relevant, but there's nothing that we could do about it. So to continue to be prompted with this threat information, in my opinion, bad job by the media. But remember, we're compelled to look at this, so they're just giving us what we want to see. So stimulus control. 2, I think, and I have a blog here that I wrote about this, right? People would say, how can I get rid of my fear? And I would say, look, you don't want to get rid of your fear. You want to channel your fear. That the fact of the matter is, when I was in a supermarket early on, the first time I had my N95 mask on, I was definitely in some type of state of hyperventilation from how hard it was to breathe. But the reason I didn't take it off is I was afraid I would get sick. So the idea is that it allows you to do the right thing when you channel it in the right way. And so you don't want to get rid of your fear. You want to channel it. You want to understand it. And in fact, if you weren't fearful, you may engage in just risky behavior, and that's not a good thing. So I think helping people reframe their fear and seeing that ultimately it's functional. This is an example of functional anxiety, unlike, let's say, maybe a person being afraid of flying, is an interesting way of looking at it. 3, for this group, this is probably something you're very familiar with, so I won't spend too much time here. But I will say that, and I think this is a result of the media, that people engaged in very kind of irrational, illogical thinking. I don't think you want to be sugarcoating anything here. We want to keep it accurate. And but definitely, I think there was this idea, look, overwhelmingly, people that had gotten COVID overwhelmingly survived, right? Whether or not the case rate of dying was actually quite low. However, people did die, and that is important to keep in mind. But people were looking at it as, if you get COVID, all or nothing thinking, you end up on a respirator and dead. And that was a very unusual outcome, right? The most rarest of outcomes for people who had COVID, but this is the one the media kept presenting to us, right? And that, as a result, we know this already from risk perception research. When we see these images, we become more frightened as though that's realistic, even if it's not. It's no different than watching stories after a plane crash. It doesn't change the risk of flying. It's still safe, but all of a sudden people start canceling their plans now that they've seen it. 4th one, I call existential acceptance. Those of us that deal with anxiety are dealing with this in some ways all the time. Quick cartoon here, right? So you want to be a little bit more sensitive than this, but, right, we need to deal with this. The difference is, all of a sudden, everyone had their existential fear of dying put in front of them, right? You couldn't ignore it. There was no way to not be thinking about your own mortality. And as a result, that, especially for people that wanted 100% of certainty that nothing bad will happen, we can't guarantee that, right? We can't guarantee anyone of anything. We could just talk about what's most probabilistic. And so as a result, people in trying to get certainty were getting more anxious. We know this already from other types of anxiety research, and we saw it playing out in this way as well. And so, if you will, we try to move towards acceptance. This is an existential reality. So if you look at, let's say, like existential psychotherapy as an example, I mean, right, and Yalom's book, Staring at the Sun, at some level, this is where we've got to go to be able to live our lives, which is to realize that, I don't know, something could come through the window in 2 minutes from now, and I might not finish this lecture. It's a possibility, but it's not probable. I think you'll get the end of it. But you do have to sort of accept those ideas. And some things are a bit riskier, and we have to be able to accept those things as well, realizing that the best we could do is manage risks, right? We can't eliminate them fully, but you wouldn't want to live totally managing risks. I think what we've all experienced, right, is I don't want to be quarantined in my house, even if it's safe, by the way. And by the way, I think that 10,000 people die from falls in their house each year. So the house might be one of the more dangerous places you are, but we don't think of it that way, right? So this is a very important area that I think needs to be addressed more. I'll come back to this a little bit later. Oh, sorry. So we're going to be moving into now sadness, which is the other primary motive, primary feeling. And I think what's interesting is what you've seen in terms of the transition is, if we were talking in April, it was more about fear. March and April, more about anxiety. And I think as the pandemic, as the COVID risk has decreased, what we're seeing now, at least in the areas where it has decreased, is we're seeing now more grief reactions, more sadness, as a result of the things that we have to do to maintain this at some level. There's a very good article about the discomfort you're feeling is grief. And it goes back to the idea that right, grief is losses. Grief is related to losses. The classic loss is death or bereavement. But what we'll see is it extends to any loss. And we've had so many losses, going back to that chart that I put up in terms of human needs, that it makes sense that we're feeling sadness and grief. Right, this is Governor Cuomo of New York State proclamation, whereas the global COVID-19 pandemic has brought unimaginable losses to New York State, right? The whole population in every way we can think of. So what I would suggest here as a general strategy is we really need to build resilience. And, I think that some people looking at this problem as a post-traumatic reaction, I'm not sure fits best. It's not, it's not trauma, or at least the way I would think about it. It's not as much a traumatic circumstance as much as an ongoing deprivation of ability to meet human needs. And resilience is geared towards helping people to meet their personal needs, even if it's not exactly the way that they want to do it. So we can look here in terms of building resilience. So and I'll get more into this, behavioral activation to meet human needs and partially restore role losses, things that provide personal meaning in the face of, at times, enormous difficulty. I'll get to that. A strategy is identify those losses and problem solve to attempt to identify ways to meet needs as well as possible. You could use the human needs hierarchy to assess. And everyone in my program knows this. I didn't realize I was saying this until someone coined this to me, but what's the tone for the context? What I say is our program's not functioning ideal, but we're moving forward, right? And this presentation today is a perfect example of that. I'd much rather do this in a place where I could see people, interact with people, even know that, that I'm not on silence or you're multitasking right now. But the reality is that this is better than not being able to do it. I look forward to doing this today. And so once again, not ideal, but moving forward. And I think that's kind of the flexible approach that we need to promote. There's a couple of, and once again, some of this comes from standard work that we already know about depression, some cognitive obstacles to behavioral activation to getting people to meet their needs. I'll go back to all or nothing thinking or no flexibility. A lot of people would say things like, if I can't take the class in person, I don't want to take it. Well, that's all or nothing thinking. There's no flexibility there. What we need to do is help people see that taking it online is better than not taking it, even if it's not as good as taking it in person. So one of the big things has to be working on increasing the ability to pivot right now, because pivot is crucial to being able to meet your needs, at least partially, because the alternative is not meeting them at all. Mood congruent processing. Once again, this is one that's been around for a while. I have one of my students, Aviva Stavsky, did her dissertation on this. In particular, we asked often depressed patients to do something that will make them feel better. The problem is, in a depressed state, they can't anticipate feeling better, right? Anhedonia. And so we can engage in something we call positive anticipation training, where we actually help people image engaging in the behavior that we're trying to get them to do, and seeing if we could at least stir up a little bit of the memory of the pleasure associated with that. Hopelessness. This is a big one. I won't say too much about this either, but one I would say, stay away from the media. The media is constantly popping things out there. Remember, the more negative it is, the more it's likely to be retweeted, the more likely the news is to read on it and so on. Doesn't matter if it's the most likely, it just matters that's the one that gets the most attention. And so people are just watching, this whole narrative that's somewhat been politicized and made to feel like, the end of the world is coming. And I'm as dystopic as the next person. I don't think that's going to happen as a result of the pandemic. I have other ideas about that. Reappraisal is that focus on the idea, once again, that people can be resilient and historically have overcome countless tragic crises. And by the way, this is very relevant. All the underlying parts are the links that you can access when you get the slides. I thought The Atlantic had a great series of articles where they actually, these were like meant to be commencement speeches for the class of 2020, but they're more relevant than that. And the idea is looking at sort of our place in history and better ways to respond to this. And I remember reading in particular Caitlin Flanagan's, who talked about her father when he came at, he's a professor at Stanford, and when he came out of college, he didn't have to face a pandemic. He literally had to enlist in the military and go fight World War II. So, right, other people throughout our history have dealt with difficult circumstances and it's made them better and they've survived it. And it's an interesting way to try to think about it, not to sugarcoat the challenges of the current moment, whether it be a war or a pandemic. So last part I'm going to cover here is promoting psychological growth in the current landscape. And I think that this is really what we want to focus the most on once we could sort of decrease some of the anxiety and the sadness. Post-traumatic growth is defined as positive change due to a struggle with a highly stressful event. So example would be a person who survives a heart attack, then stops smoking, begins exercising and eating healthier. They're better because of that traumatic event, scared them. And this is an interesting area. And just to acknowledge these slides, the next few slides with the red bottom come from my former student, Zakia Biggio-Klurfeld. And by the way, if anybody's looking for someone to speak on this area, she has expertise. She did her dissertation that's just in the, was just published on this. And just a couple of points to make here. One is any loss creates grief similar to bereavement. So if you will, if you lose your job, if you're divorced, but it could extend beyond that. You know, if you can't teach in the classroom and you really like doing that, at some level, you're gonna have a grief reaction. If you're used to seeing your family members more frequently, you're seeing them less, that has a similar grief reaction. So it goes back to that idea that grief is just so much a part of the fabric of the current landscape. But one interesting thing that she found in the study is 72% of participants, by the way, this is with no intervention, provided behavioral examples of post-traumatic growth, right? That they made a positive change. And for time's sake, I'm not gonna go through most of these, but once again, they're all there on the slides. But just as an example, post-traumatic growth examples that were coded in her study, increased appreciation for life after the trauma, more meaningful relationships, increased personal strength, change priorities, richer spiritual existential life. And I know certainly in my own current experiences, all the things I took for granted, the ability to travel on vacation that I didn't do this June, to eat in a restaurant, to see a movie in a movie theater, to teach in a classroom, right? I will appreciate those things much more than I did in the past by having them taken away from me. And certainly there's lots of other ways of looking at this process. So for time's sake, I'm gonna not talk about the rest of these, but once again, they're all there in the slideshow that I'll give you the link to. But let's talk about how to facilitate post-traumatic growth in therapy, right? One is, don't just expect disturbance and dysfunction. Try to make space for growth, move beyond symptom reduction, like going back to the idea, like don't try to get rid of the fear. Let's just focus on the idea of doing what you need to do to keep safe. And in the end, that will be your best solution to dealing with fear. Two, find out about their history of resilience, overcoming past hardships. Many people have survived difficult situations, and then you can actually try to, by focusing on those strengths, you can try to maximize their ability to deal with the current hardship. Or even just to show them that despite maybe they thought there was no future after that last hardship, that they lived another day, so to speak, and there's no reason that this can't be that way in general. And when relevant, reappraise the threat as a challenge. I mean, I think that's the idea. I know myself, I look at it as a clinical psychologist, the challenge is to us to go out there and help people who have this, the effects of the pandemic. And because this is what we're trained for. It may not be the way we expected to do things, but it is what we're trained for, and there's nobody in a better position to do that. So she actually gave an interesting example of post-traumatic growth in clinical psychology. So the grief, loss of in-person connectedness, right? So not seeing your clients or patients in in person. And she cited an article by Nancy McWilliams, which is worth reading, which is the idea that before this, patients and maybe even ourselves, we felt like these saviors in some ways. And the fact is we were going through the same thing as they were. We were scared, we were quarantined, right? We were having our needs blocked from being met. We didn't want to do Zoom sessions. And it's sort of an interesting perspective. Well, what's the growth that could come from that, right? Interesting articles on this, authentic therapy relationships, the ability at some level to both, first of all, share the fact that we're all going through the pandemic, but also people would see people's living spaces, see their dogs or their family members. I know I even had read that people had been treating people for years and never met some other family members that happened as a result of the online sessions. I think certainly what you're going to see is a lot more attention to mental health issues. The main reason is everyone all of a sudden found that mental health issues arrived on their doorstep. They were feeling too fearful or sad. And I think it gave a better appreciation for people for mental health issues in general. I think a growth that's going to come from this is the continuation of the ability to do telehealth, increases flexibility. And in New York State, they're trying to have a law passed that will allow this to continue. And living through history, certainly we could be survivors of this. And I think that that in the end, it'll be a conversation that once again, hopefully we could think of ourselves better off as a result of. So let me just point this out too. I won't get too much into this, but some people have expressed interest in this and I wanted to throw it out there, and the document is available as well. We have been providing what we call a COVID consultation service. We were thinking about, myself and my students were thinking about how to create a scalable treatment for a mental health pandemic if in fact one occurs. And the main way this became an idea for me is talking to someone that had been to a dietitian. And I said, well, what did they do? And I said, I went in and met with them and they found out about my eating. And then they told me what to do. And then I went back and they checked to see how it was working. And I thought that seemed like a reasonable model if we could apply our strategies in that sort of format. And then we also based it on Jessica Schleider at Stony Brook, who's been doing research on a single session treatment model. So we're like, all right, we're going to do double single session, 2 sessions. Seems like a lot by that standard. And this was based on a secondary prevention model, meaning get the people that are distressed now to avoid a bigger problem later on, where the distress now can devolve into a longer standing anxiety, depression, or whatever else may occur as a result of that. And this model is based on a stepwise care model. ADAA put out something, I think it's available for free on their website. The idea is that everyone doesn't need a lot of treatment. Some people might need just 1 meeting or 2 meetings, and then some people might need more. Start with a little bit, see if that makes a difference, and then make decisions after that. Not usually the way we go about this in a standard model. Not a bad thing to think about in general, by the way. And so this is from our website description. And once again, I want to leave time for questions. So I'll just kind of leave you with, this is the main description. Our 2-session consultation service is designed to address COVID-related distress using strategies from CBT. And so the idea is it's not general counseling, it's to address specific problems that resulted as a result of COVID and quarantine. And we sort of explain that in that so that people know what they're getting. By the way, the document is available here. If you want to see the outline of this document, you can access it here. And so we sort of start with this idea similar to Schleider's miracle question. If you could change one thing that would make a difference right now, what it would be. And then we attempt to solve that problem with the person, informing them on use of strategies, giving them our self-help guide, and helping them implement it, think about ways to implement this change, and whatever it is, whether it be loneliness, lack of meaning, lack of activity, people had eating problems, people were using too much substances. There are lots of problems that we saw as a result of this. And then the next meeting is sort of a check-in about a week or 10 days later, go over it, kind of help them modify it a bit if it wasn't working to see if we could still make some a change there. And what's interesting, we only have a small number of data at this point. We're expecting to get more, but the preliminary data are actually quite impressive on feasibility. I mean, people want this, they access it, it's easy to do remotely. The clients greatly valued it in terms of a rating that we asked them, and we reduced symptom reduction. We created symptom reduction by the follow-up appointment, maybe about 35%. So this is worth thinking about. Now, maybe it should be 4 sessions or 3 sessions or whatever, but the idea of making it more scalable, I think, is the thing that we should be trying to focus on. So just my closing, and I'd be glad to take questions. So I'll give you my own post-traumatic growth story here. So this is my grief. Actually, I love Apple computers, by the way, but before the pandemic. But now I feel like my whole life is sitting in front of an Apple computer, and I do everything. I do appointments this way. I teach my classes. I interact with people. Certainly that's improving in New York, but that's my grief. But the good news is, since I'm always home, I've lost my commute, and that allowed me to, my growth area is every morning I start my day with a walk with Joseph and Peaches to a pond. And that's been amazingly satisfying for me, something that I did not have the ability to do before when I had to get to different places depending on the day of the week. And now, just to go back to the evolutionary psychology explanation, I'm not such a great person to do this because Joseph shares 25% of my genes. So I'm making an investment like we suggested, actually not so different than this mother swan here that's leading her, I don't know what baby swans are called, I'm sure they have a specific term, but leading the way for them because of genetics, right? And so absolutely, I'm very invested emotionally, but probably because of underlying genetics. I'm not sure if I feel this way about 3-year-olds in general. And I just leave you with a paradox, but what about Peaches? Peaches is 0% related to me, but I also care a great amount for her as well, and have found this an area of growth. How would you explain my post-traumatic growth with regard to Peaches? By the way, there is an explanation. Oh. Thank you for your attention. I'd be glad to answer any questions that that people have along the way. I just can't, I don't know if I'm going to see them or hear them.
Okay, I'm happy to jump in here and ask some questions. So I think maybe there were a few questions on human nature and then several on pandemic related. So let's start with the human nature questions and we'll see where we get.
Sure.
So one was a very controversial question. Do you believe in heterogeneity in human nature within species, i.e. across different ethnic, racial, geographic groups?
So, I mean, there is to some degree, right? You just know that, and I'd rather not get into that controversy right now, but people certainly talk about this and believe in heterogeneity certainly across physical structures in different races. We know that, it's observable to us, so it's not really a controversial statement to make, right? I mean, someone who's talked about this said, you know, there's no Eskimo long distance runners, as an example, right? It wouldn't make sense for that group to evolve in that way. What I wanted to say is that, but when it comes to the mind, everybody had the same problems. So as a result, then you had the same solutions. And I think there's less heterogeneity. Everyone had to survive and reproduce and care for their offspring, and social species get along with others. So as a result, I believe there's less heterogeneity of the mind than of certain physical structures that might be somewhat environmental specific.
Okay, and then I guess to add to that, another, I guess, pretty topical question would be, so the examples that you gave of differences between male and female seem limited to cisgender. So what about gender fluidity, homosexuality? How are those types of human diversity related to evolutionarily relevant mental processes? And I don't know that you'll be able to answer that.
Yeah. So
2 minutes.
I don't shy away from these third rail questions. It's hard to set a context for them though, and it requires a certain context. What I will say is that what we see, though, let me think of how to answer this in the most specific way. What we see is, regardless of sexuality, we actually, with regardless of sexual preference, we actually see still pretty much stereotypical male and female behavior. So, so as a result, that it still sort of makes sense in a more bivariate way in terms of behaviorally, like say aggression as an example. That one would play out either way. So yeah, I appreciate those questions, and I teach a course on this, and I'm happy to sort of take that up. But it just these are questions in 2-minute answers that are being recorded that you can get into trouble for.
I hear you.
I had a bad week last week, so I'm extra sensitive to this.
Okay.
In this way.
Okay. Do you believe that human nature is malleable?
No. Very little. I mean, we're more enlightened than ever before. So if you go back from an evolutionary perspective, only to the Middle Ages are not that long ago, right? If you want to go back to like 600 AD, it's not that long ago. And I guess for people that watch these various shows about the Middle Ages, you could see like people were pretty brutal, right? They make us look really good. However, the fact of the matter is that if you look at modern behavior, and I'm actually in the process of posting, I have on my website, I'm actually in the process of posting a lecture that I did on this, on existential threats and human nature. Humans still mistreat humans to an enormous degree worldwide. And just as an example, like we're not a very cooperative species. And meaning literally depriving people of food and water, literally, by the way. So, or clean water anyway. So I don't think we're that different. We're more modernized, but we're not so much better. We're just another species. And our moral code is very buggy. And people write about this like Diana Fleischman, who studies more evolution of morality. Yeah, not very malleable.
Okay. All right, so I think now most of the remaining questions are about the COVID response. I know you had provided some resources, but one question was, do you have a recommendation for therapists who have this level of understanding? Where could patients find access to this if they're not, if whoever they're working with doesn't know about this?
Yeah, so I mean, I think part of the reason for today, I mean, my feeling is that people that are well-trained in CBT, my bias, right? But people well-trained in CBT can easily adapt the strategies with just a slightly different framework that I was providing today very briefly. But once again, it's in the document much more detailed. So, and I do think that therapists, I mean, look, the reality is there's nothing that's had a greater impact on people's day-to-day functioning in this. This is going to be the story for at least the next couple of years. So it's certainly a motivation for therapists to do that. But I don't know, I mean, at this point, I don't know of any, COVID specific therapists or pandemic related therapists. Yep. Okay.
What are your thoughts about someone who says that they don't have fear or sadness, but rather frustration?
Yeah, so we dealt with frustration in the document, and that's also a common feeling. And, look, frustration is an emotion that results from basically often inability, like blocking your goals, so to speak, right? Blocking your goal attainment. That's the frustration aggression hypothesis that still makes a lot of sense. And I think, though, once again, it's sort of at some level more back to sort of cognitive reappraisal and acceptance of the fact that, this is the new normal right now, and things are more frustrating. That is the reality. And the best thing that you could do is, once again, try to focus on maybe whatever advantages that you have and try to keep the frustration to a minimum. I'll just give you a quick example. I remember I was doing some food shopping earlier on. So it was like, 30 degrees out, a mist, and I was waiting outside with like multiple lists to shop for different people. And I realized how frustrated I felt. I felt like pushing everybody out of the way and going in the store, but I didn't do that. And what I realized is I needed to from now on listen to my favorite podcast while I'm online, and that totally changed my experience. So like, hey, I'm listening to a podcast while I'm shopping, rather than me focused on the fact that I'm standing there and being blocked. But the frustration's not so different than depression and anxiety. It's a real feeling right now because we really are being blocked from meeting some of our goals.
What's your favorite podcast?
Sam Harris.
Oh, okay.
Lindsay, how about this question?
Yep.
In my experience, some people I know are developing increased anxiety over this pandemic when they see others in their households, their siblings, their children, are not taking the pandemic and the precautions seriously. And this lack of concern for their own safety can exacerbate the anxiety of other people in their others in the household. How would you recommend that one deal with this type of situation? And more generally, from an evolutionary standpoint, why are some people taking this seriously and others are not? You know, the people that aren't wearing masks, the people that are going out with their friends, etc.
Yeah. Well, the first question, I mean, people have written a bit about this already, which is, it's a good question. So it's great if everybody in your house matches on your risk perception, but if you don't, then it creates problems because this is something that you could bring into the house, so to speak. So look, humans are in constant conflict, right? Family dynamics are such that this just is bringing a new thing into the situation. But I think the best that can be recommended is to try to reach some type of reasonable middle ground. It may be that the two extremes are often, I mean, no one could fully, or let me change that. Most people cannot fully quarantine as an example in the beginning. You just couldn't do it. You needed to go out to get food, if nothing else. On the other hand, like running out for something that's irrelevant seems to be overly risky, and it may be worth discussions there. Maybe a family therapist or a therapist. But I have heard that one come up a lot. I think so look, people have different levels of anxiety, and they take risks process risks differently, and that could certainly be part of the question that you're answering. I do believe, though, unfortunately, the whole pandemic, and this, I won't go off on this tangent, but the whole pandemic has even become politicized. And now wearing a mask or not wearing a mask is what we call in evolutionary psychology a signal or virtue signal. And the idea, like, if you're wearing it, you're on one side, and if you're not wearing it, you're on the other side. And this has become very explicit. And unfortunately, that's our greatest problem, is we can't do anything because everything is a controversy right now. And so, right, people are being irresponsible, or maybe, by the way, too cautious wearing masks. I mean, there's no evidence that you could get this walking around outside, as an example, just walking around, yet people are wearing a mask under those circumstances and look at you like maybe you should be. So it's sort of an interesting phenomenon.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we should, there's a good question about how can you apply the strategies about post-traumatic growth with clients who are actually experiencing food insecurity, death of loved ones, et cetera.
Yeah.
We know the pandemic is disproportionately impacting low SES individuals and families in Black communities in particular. How do these skills apply to significant loss as a result of the pandemic and to actual ongoing danger?
Yeah, well, I did write about this, just for the record here. I want to just point to this because I think it's a great question, and I so I just want to point out here that I think the good news is that mental health treatments have gotten so much attention, but they're not magic. And what I point out in this article is that financial instability in particular, I mean, bereavement is always a problem. And I think people can get over that. I mean, people do get over bereavement. And certainly it's more complicated in this current situation because people couldn't do sort of rituals that they normally do to facilitate bereavement and so on. But I think that when you're getting into economic issues, which are really the foundation of that human needs hierarchy, mental health treatments are not going to address that. And that's what I'm trying to point out here. But the fact is, you have to figure out a way, let's just talk about the country, nationally, to provide people with basic income so that they don't have, if you have an unemployment rate of 25 or 30%, mental health treatments are not going to resolve that. And so I wanted to distinguish between things that people could pivot and realistically partially meet their needs versus losing your home or not being able to provide food and so on. In my opinion, that's not a mental health treatment issue. It's a societal issue that we need to take very seriously, and I don't think we are. And for the record, this was a problem before the pandemic. The pandemic has only highlighted it, right? And we knew this was a problem before, that automation is taking jobs away from people And as a result, there's greater wealth disparity. So I'm not making a socialist statement here because I don't believe in that system, but I do think we need to take this piece seriously. So I like that question. And I'm basically saying that this has to be more of a national issue. Mental health treatments are not magical.
That's right.
Maybe medication will help with that, but.
Right. And I do think mental health has to stay in its own lane. And, it's important for us to understand that can't cure fundamental economic and social inequality. Yeah. So
it goes right back to the basic human needs hierarchy that if you have that destabilized, you can't go forward. Or it's very hard to go forward.
And that's why there weren't therapists 1,000 years ago, right? Because people were just trying to survive. Yeah.
Hunter-gatherers have no anxiety or depression or cancer, for the record.
That's right. That's right.
Current societies.
Right. And, I don't know if we have time for one or two more, but people want to know, what is your evolutionary attachment to peaches?
You really want to know? So in evolutionary psychology, there's something called byproducts. So they were not adaptations, but they partially satisfy adaptations. So I have a parenting instinct, right? As a human, and males have maybe not quite as much as females, but parenting instinct. And so Peaches meets that. She came before Joseph. It's my daughter's dog. She came before Joseph. So she met that parenting instinct. And there's some fascinating writings on this, including like people baby talk to their dogs, right? Right. And they call them like baby names. So the reality is it's called the byproduct. Yep. So you will favor byproducts. Yep.
Wouldn't that also be the same explanation, I guess, at a more indirect level for an adopted child who doesn't have your biological genes?
Yeah, yes, but a child is more direct. So look, I don't think that we really make conscious decisions about genetics, but it definitely matters. Yeah. Yep.
So someone wrote, how with this mismatched industrial environment would you discuss, that you discussed to our human nature, can we evolve and be nurtured because the environment is so toxic, not like 1918?
Yeah, I think that mental health professionals are fighting an uphill battle. And by the way, so I know this is maybe not the most uplifting aspect here, but basically the society and the culture is becoming more of a mismatch, more artificial foods, less movement, less sunlight, less meaning in people's jobs, less jobs, right? And as a result, we can't meet our needs. And like someone mentioned, if you're a hunter-gatherer, you just need to worry about catching your food. You're not worrying about filling out a values form and figuring out how you're gonna meet your values for the day. And the bigger issue for me, my biggest interest, by the way, is that we don't take human nature seriously, and we don't realize just how bad the changes in environment are, not only physical health, which have been undone to some degree by medical marvel, but mental health. So I think we need to pay more attention to the environment, whether it be distribution of resources. And look, my main suggestion is like, get off of any type of social media. It's just bad. I mean, the data it's like worse than smoking, in terms of the data. And yet we're addicted to it. We allow them to take our privacy. We know they manipulate it. They have algorithms that manipulate the way we make decisions. Like Google and Facebook are not worth $1 trillion for no reason, right? Think about it. They don't collect any money from us. There's got to be a reason they're worth $1 trillion each. So sorry, they're not sponsoring this talk today.
Speaking of addictive behavior, one person had a question: is your view of problematic addictive behavior generally, such as alcohol or heroin, similar to your view about food and obesity? Yeah.
So yes and no. So they could be both addictions. I think food, the problem is that if you look at obesity, so obviously there's a certain level of genetic obesity, but any genetic researcher would say you can't get an increase from 1960 to 2030 at that rate. It's just impossible, right? So the reality is when people are looking more at this, what they're finding is it's kind of the westernized or industrialized diet that's creating the problem. So meaning, like, if I've just eaten dinner, I'm not going to eat a celery stick, but I will eat ice cream. So these high calorie foods you can eat even when you're full, and we weren't built to eat when we're full. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But let's go back to substance abuse. The problem with substance abuse, right? Look, opiate addiction is climbing at the highest rate of any drug. And the reason is it gives people a sense of euphoria. And the reality is someone's written a book about this recently. It goes back to the idea of people are looking for meaning. They can't get it. You could take a pill and you get it. A lot of people stumble onto it. They had a legitimate pain problem, and what they notice is they feel better. And then some of the most dystopic views of what's going to happen with our world, maybe not in the relatively near future, is you literally will have everybody like Brave New World on like an opiate type of drug just to keep them placid, and you'll be doling them out enough money to meet their resources. Read Yuval Harari's book, Homo Deus, The Future of Mankind, and he's an Israeli philosopher, and I think he's nailed it. And people like Andrew Yang, who's a presidential candidate, that he has the data to support his points. This is very concerning. And it should be something that we're all talking about, rather than usually we're often on talking about things that are not that meaningful in politics.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think we'll end there. That seems like a great place to hop off.
Great.
And by the way, Lindsay, I think there have been a number of questions about whether this presentation will be available to be seen, whether it was recorded, and we did record it. We will have it up on our website at nyc-cbt.org very soon, and on our YouTube channel. And I believe there were also some questions both about the manual that Dr. Sanderson mentioned. It's at Sanderson.
Do you see this still? So the pandemic paper, the self-help manual, and the slides for today are available at this site.
So everyone copy that down now. It's highlighted right on the screen. So that way everyone can have access to this wonderful presentation. And we'll just give people a minute to do that before signing off. Any last words before we end?
Nope, thank you so much, Dr. Sanderson. It was a
thank you. Yeah.
fabulous talk.
Take human nature seriously, not because of clinical psychology. This is the last phase of my career, is not to be like overly dramatic here, but I'm really trying to get this out there. And the internet, it makes it easier. And I appreciate being able to give this talk today, but I do believe that we have this in us to really make a big difference in the direction the world works, but we're not paying attention to it. And we have ideological explanations rather than empirical, and that's further creating problems for us. Not solving problems, further creating problems. So I'll leave it at there, and I appreciate being here. I can't see anybody, but there may be people here that I know, colleagues and so on. I'm sure that's the case.
Yes, and we've gotten a lot of great comments and feedback already. So thank you so much for doing this talk.
Thanks.
Have a good day, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.